Hey guys, tonight we begin with the immensely hard life that ancient Egyptians had. What did people in ancient Egypt actually eat and do all day? So before you get nice and comfortable, take a moment of your precious time and like and subscribe to the video because it helps a ton the channel. Also comment down below what time is it for you and where are you watching from. It is always fascinating seeing from what part of the world you guys are. Now relax, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, and close your eyes for a moment and picture the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago. The sun has barely begun its climb over the horizon, but life is already stirring in the warm, fragrant air. A farmer rises before dawn, his feet brushing over the cool earthen floor of his modest mud-brick house. Outside, he can hear the distant bleating of goats, the soft murmur of the river that never truly sleeps, and the gentle rustle of date palms shifting in the morning breeze. This is not a place of grand pyramids and golden treasures, not yet. This is where ordinary people live out their days, planting seeds, drawing water, raising families, and gathering what the river's blessings have to offer. It is easy to imagine ancient Egypt only through the eyes of its mighty pharaohs and painted tombs. But beneath all that splendor was a living, breathing world where the humble bowl of grain, the bubbling clay pot of stew, and the daily breaking of bread were acts as vital as any royal decree. Tonight, or perhaps as dawn rises and you drift off, we will walk quietly through that world. We'll stand beside the silt-rich fields as farmers cut down sheaves of emmer wheat. We'll step inside clay ovens as bakers tend to rows of round, ash-dusted loaves. We'll taste the warm, slightly sour beer that flowed from battered jars into clay cups, passed from calloused hand to calloused hand. We'll linger in the heat of small kitchens, feel the rough texture of a reed basket filled with onions and garlic, smell the sweetness of dried figs stored for a festival day. And in doing so, we'll see how the Nile's gifts, humble, everyday, and endlessly renewing, shaped one of history's greatest civilizations, meal by meal, harvest by harvest. So settle into your pillow, let your mind drift like a reed boat on the river, and we'll begin our slow, winding feast through ancient kitchens and forgotten fields. Segment 1, The River's Gift. How the Nile fed a civilization long before you might smell the warm bread or hear the soft laughter around an evening meal. There is only the river, vast, steady, and patient. The Nile is not simply a river in the way a stream might wind through a village today. It is a lifeline, a moving heartbeat that carried water, silt, and fish to the people who gathered along its banks. Each year, as if by divine promise, the Nile would flood its banks. For weeks, the river would spill into the fields, soaking them in rich, dark silt. This flooding, so feared in other parts of the world, was welcomed here with quiet gratitude and careful planning. The people depended on its rhythm, watching the water rise, marking the level on stone steps and carved pillars to predict what the harvest would bring. When the waters receded, they left behind a soft, fertile soil ready to receive seeds of emmer wheat and barley. Farmers, working shoulder to shoulder with families and neighbors, turned the damp earth with simple wooden plows drawn by oxen. Some stood barefoot in the muck, scattering seed by hand, trusting the river's gift to feed their children through the next cycle of sun and moon. It wasn't just the crops. The river teemed with fish, catfish, Nile perch, mullet, caught by simple reed nets and hooks of twisted copper. Men and boys stood in shallow channels, throwing nets in graceful arcs, pulling in their wriggling catch to be salted or roasted over an open flame. Even crocodiles and hippos, feared and respected in equal measure, were part of this living river story, reminders that the Nile gave but could also take away. Beside the fields, date palms stretched their fronds toward the sun. Farmers tended small orchards, coaxing figs, pomegranates, and grapes from the same fertile banks. What the river didn't provide directly, its water made possible. a long ribbon of green cutting through dry, endless desert. The canals dug by calloused hands guided the Nile's bounty far beyond its banks. Intricate irrigation channels branched off like veins, carrying precious water to distant plots of onions, garlic, chickpeas, and lentils. When a field needed more, neighbors lifted water with simple shadoofs, long wooden poles with buckets, counterweighted by stones, swinging them rhythmically all day long. Sometimes a harvest was so good that granaries overflowed and families filled clay jars with surplus grain. This grain became daily bread, beer, and porridge, the backbone of every meal. It was currency, security, and offering all in one. A good harvest was life. A failed flood was hardship, and sometimes famine. And so the people watched the river year after year, measuring its blessings and whispering prayers to keep its flow steady. When night fell on the riverbanks, you could hear the soft splash of water against boats returning with fish. You could see the flicker of small fires in distant fields where workers rested, breaking loaves and dipping them in simple stews flavored with leeks and herbs. Even the poorest table still owed its scrap of bread and mouthful of beer to the river's slow, unwavering gift. So as you drift deeper into this ancient world, remember that every meal, every crumb, every sip of beer began with the Nile's gentle rise and fall. Without its generous flood, the stone tombs would stand empty, the temples silent, the fields turned to dust. In ancient Egypt, food and the river were one, and in that union, a civilization found its heart. Picture the dawn again, the sun now a soft glow, slipping over the low roofs of mudbrick houses, the shadows stretching long across dusty courtyards. Inside these small homes, another day's labor begins not in the fields, but at a simple stone slab tucked into a quiet corner. This is the domain of the grindstone, where the daily ritual of turning grain into life-giving bread begins. Most households in ancient Egypt made their own flour by hand. The tools were simple, a flat stone quern and a smooth, oblong handstone. Grinding grain by hand was labor that wore grooves deep into the stones and deeper still into shoulders and arms. The fine dust rose in the air and settled on skin and hair, clinging to sweat. Neighbors might gather near the warm ovens, swapping gossip and news. Children played nearby, snatching bits of leftover dough to nibble raw. Workers who built temples and pyramids were partly paid in bread and beer. Tomb paintings show loaves stacked like treasures, shaped to please the gods in the next life. Priests offered bread at altars, believing the spirits of the deceased would draw nourishment from its humble grains. The smell that drifted up, nutty, toasty, slightly sour, was the smell of life itself. And there, the day's first true meal could begin. And the river slipped by in silence. There was no greater comfort than the smell of baking bread. It was proof that life, despite its hardships, could be shaped by patient hands, passed from one generation to the next, always rising again with the morning sun. A chunk of bread, dipped in a little pot of oil or scooped into a thick bean stew, carried the river's gift one step further, from soil and water, through calloused hands and grinding stones, to the heart of a family's table. Over time, grit from the stones mingled with the flour, which meant that Egyptian bread was often rough on the teeth. Many ancient skulls show teeth worn down to the gum from years of eating coarse, sandy loaves. In big cities and temple complexes, professional bakeries baked on a larger scale. Here, massive batches of dough were prepared in big clay tubs, shaped by teams of workers who moved in steady rhythm, feeding the hunger of hundreds. Inside, fires of dried wood, straw, or palm fronds were lit until the walls glowed with stored heat. Then the ashes were swept aside, and the loaves were carefully placed inside, leaning against the oven's inner walls or balanced on stones heated by the flames. A woman, often with her daughter or another family member, would kneel over the quern. She'd pour a small mound of grain, usually emmer wheat or barley, and pressed the handstone forward and back in a slow, steady motion. The sound was like a hush, a gentle scraping that filled the early hours while the village slowly came awake. This was no quick task. When enough flour was ground, it was sifted by hand through woven sieves. Then came the mixing water from clay jars, a pinch of leftover dough to start the souring, perhaps a touch of salt if it was within reach. Some households added honey or dates to sweeten special loaves for festivals or offerings, but most daily bread was plain, hearty enough to fill the stomachs of farmers, laborers, and children alike. The dough was kneaded on flat boards or clean reed mats, patted and turned until it grew elastic and warm under tired hands. Sometimes it was shaped into round, flat discs. Other times it was pinched into tall, cone-like loaves, meant to stand upright in the heat of the oven. Out behind many homes stood small dome-shaped clay ovens. Some were built right into courtyard walls, a low, squat belly of mudbrick, lined with baked clay. Baking was both a chore and a chance for talk and quiet moments. For grander occasions or large households, there were village bakers, men who worked in small, smoky shops turning out rows of loaves for workers, priests, and sometimes temples. Bread was never just bread. It was daily sustenance, tax payment, temple offering, and sacred symbol. Back in the small courtyard, as the baked loaves were pulled from the oven, warm, steaming, charred here, in the hush of an ancient Egyptian dawn, when the fields were still wet with dew, step beyond the low mud-brick houses, out into the small plots of tilled earth that stretched behind many village homes. These gardens were the quiet, constant backbone of everyday Egyptian meals. Simple patches of green, carved from the rich, dark soil left behind when the Nile's floodwaters receded each year. Even the poorest households tried to keep a small garden if they could. Some plots were no larger than a courtyard. Others unfurled like narrow ribbons along the banks of small irrigation canals, each furrow fed by hand-carried water in clay pots or lifted in leather buckets with simple shadoofs. Wooden levers weighted with stones to make raising water easier. In a land where bread and beer fed the masses, vegetables and legumes brought variety and vital nourishment. Shade trees, sycamores, date palms might stand guard at the edges, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Some families trained vines along wooden frames to shelter tender plants from the searing midday sun. Dill, mint, and fenugreek added small sparks of flavor to daily meals and simple remedies for minor ailments. Insects and grazing animals were constant threats, yet the rewards were worth it. A basket of fresh cucumbers on a hot day, a pot of lentil stew to feed hungry children. In tomb offerings, baskets of onions and garlic stood alongside loaves of bread and jugs of beer, a meal fit for both the living and the spirits who lingered near their burial places. They filled empty stomachs when fish were scarce and meat was beyond reach. They balanced the grain-heavy diet that wore down teeth and bellies alike. They turned modest clay plots behind simple mud-brick walls into spaces of life, color, and quiet pride. A few bulbs of garlic hung in the shade to dry for leaner times. A hunk of bread torn from a fresh loaf, dipped into a dish of mashed fava beans flavored with garlic and oil. A garden that fed not just the body, but the heart, tying a family to the land, season by season, seed by seed, harvest by humble harvest. A handful of sliced cucumbers sprinkled with salt, if any was at hand. Children munching radishes with dirt still clinging to their skins. A handful of herbs mixed into a stew or pressed into oil made plain vegetables taste new again. Gardens could be beautiful as well as practical, a small oasis of green where family life and food production intertwined. Imagine a family at work in the early light. A father stoops to check rows of onions, their green shoots bending gently in the warm breeze. Simple clay pots and shallow dishes held stews that simmered slowly over small hearths. The smell of garlic and leeks frying in oil drifted through doorways. In homes that could afford spices, coriander and cumin added warmth to the bubbling pots. There, vegetables were grown in bigger quantities, tended by hired hands and tenant farmers who paid part of their harvest to landowners or priests. These larger plots fed not only local families, but also temple workers, officials, and the countless laborers who kept Egypt's monuments rising from the desert sands. Salt was precious, carried in by traders or gathered in coastal marshes, but even a pinch could lift a bland dish into something more comforting. A mother moves carefully among leafy lettuces, plucking stray weeds, inspecting the soil for pests. Fava beans, broad beans, thrived in the fertile soil. Once harvested, they were dried in the sun, stored in woven baskets, and later boiled into thick stews or mashed with herbs and oil. Chickpeas added protein to meals that might otherwise be little more than bread and greens. In temple records and household lists, lentils appear again and again, a sign of their importance, especially for families who could rarely afford meat. Children chase one another between low beds of leeks and garlic, their laughter drifting toward the river where water birds stir in the reeds. Fresh greens, lettuces, and endive were plucked and eaten quickly before the heat turned their tender leaves to wilted scraps. The taste was sharp, peppery, cleansing. Tomb paintings show humble baskets brimming with garden produce, offered with care to gods and ancestors alike, proof that even the smallest harvest could hold spiritual meaning. Beans and lentils, humble yet hardy, were staples. Vegetables like cucumbers, radishes, and cabbages brought welcome crispness to meals otherwise dominated by coarse loaves and porridge. In wealthier estates, larger gardens were laid out in neat rows, often ringed by mud-brick walls to keep goats and wandering donkeys away. Inside village kitchens, vegetables were rinsed in clay basins, then chopped with bronze knives on reed mats or wooden boards. Herbs grew in clay jars on windowsills and courtyard corners. Work in the gardens never truly stopped. Seeds had to be gathered at harvest time, dried and stored for the next planting. Irrigation channels needed clearing after every flood. Beyond the household garden, larger fields stretched out in patches near the edge of villages and temples. During festivals, vegetables took on added significance. On feast days dedicated to Osiris, god of rebirth and agriculture, fresh greens symbolized renewal and the promise of life after death. And yet, for all their sacred symbolism, these garden crops remained practical at heart. As the sun climbed high and heat pressed down on the land, families might gather under the shade of a palm or sycamore to rest and share the midday meal. This was daily survival in ancient Egypt. A handful of simple plants coaxed from stubborn earth with water, labor, and hope. Picture a village courtyard in the early dawn. Chickens cluck restlessly in a reed coop. Goats shift and bleat as they wait for the boy tasked with herding them to the scrubland beyond the village edge. A lean, long-horned cow flicks its tail at flies, its ribs faintly visible beneath dusty skin. For most ancient Egyptians, these animals were more valuable alive than on the family table. Sources of milk, dung for fuel, and offspring that might be traded or offered as temple tribute. Yet meat, real meat, held an allure both practical and symbolic. For the majority of families, a taste of roasted goat or a stew made from a single bony fowl was reserved for special days, when the hum of daily toil gave way to celebration. These creatures roamed Egypt's borders, offering a fleeting chance at fresh meat. A family that owned a few goats or sheep might slaughter one for a wedding or a funeral, sharing cuts with neighbors to spread both cost and celebration. A goat might be tethered, its bleating mixing with the hush of onlookers. A sharp flint or bronze blade was pressed to its throat, blood caught in clay vessels to be poured out on the earth or offered to household gods. Nothing was wasted, meat divided by cut and quality, the best portions reserved for elders, guests, or honored priests. Fish from the Nile, tilapia, catfish, mullet, were caught in woven reed nets or with hook and line from small reed boats. Dried, salted, or grilled fresh on small fires, fish provided an accessible alternative to meat. The embers of the fire glowed faintly in the courtyard, a sign that, for at least this night, bellies were full, and the bonds of family and neighborly goodwill were strong. A fleeting reminder of the land's generosity and the fragile prosperity it offered those who worked it. Though in some religious contexts certain fish were taboo, sacred to gods like Osiris, and thus forbidden to eat. The hide was cleaned and dried for sandals or water skins. Horns were carved into simple tools or ornaments. It symbolized prosperity, sacrifice, and connection, a bridge between the human and divine. To sit at a meal where meat was served, however modest the cut, was to know a moment of abundance in a world where most nourishment came from grain and gardens. Even bones might be saved for soup stock or shaped into needles. Chickens, though not native to Egypt in the earliest periods, gradually became more common, adding eggs and the occasional roast bird to rural tables. Yet such hunts were perilous and time-consuming, more likely undertaken by professional hunters supplying royal kitchens or temple offerings than by farmers too bound to their fields to wander far. These were not just food, but living signs of prosperity and status. The fat from richer cuts was prized, skimmed, and used for cooking or for lamps. The smell of roasting meat drifting through a village signaled a day of importance. Neighbors gathering with clay jugs of beer, children waiting for scraps and marrow bones to chew. In larger estates, whole cattle or oxen were spit-roasted over open pits during grand banquets, their size and abundance echoing power as much as appetite. Taxes might be paid in livestock. Priests demanded animal sacrifices as offerings to the gods: a calf, a ram, a goose, each animal chosen for its symbolic worth, as well as the sustenance it provided to temple workers and priests. Weddings, births, funerals, harvest feasts, and festivals honoring the gods. These were the moments when meat was carried home, butchered carefully, and prepared with ritual and care. Herds dedicated to major temples were vast, tended by whole communities of workers and herders. These animals were sacrificed daily, a steady stream of cattle, sheep, goats, and geese offered to gods who, according to belief, sustained the cosmic order in exchange for earthly tribute. After ritual butchering, the meat did not rot in silent sanctuaries. It fed the priests, workers, scribes, and laborers who maintained Egypt's monumental temples and tombs. In the fertile fields near larger estates, wealthier families kept herds of cattle and flocks of sheep and goats. Hunting was another path to meat, though mostly for those who could afford the time, tools, and permission. Imagine a nobleman and his retinue poling quietly through a papyrus thicket in the delta marshes. Tomb paintings often show these hunting scenes in lush detail. Men poised with spears and sticks, children watching wide-eyed, servants carrying the spoils back to a waiting household. But these depictions, so vivid on plaster walls, belong to the comfortable lives of elites. For most peasants, hunting game birds in temple lands or the estates of the powerful could bring harsh punishment if done without permission. The air buzzes with insects, birdsong rings out across the reeds, and at any moment, a sudden flurry of wings signals that ducks or geese are rising into the sky. Hunters swing throwing sticks, curved clubs designed to knock birds from the air. Net traps lie hidden among the reeds. Boys wade into the shallows to flush out waterfowl. A good hunt could yield a basket of fresh game, ducks, geese, or quail to be plucked and roasted over small fires. In the desert fringes, hunters and herders chased gazelles, wild cattle, or even the occasional oryx. Back in the village, domesticated animals provided the more common, if still rare source of meat. When the day came to slaughter an animal, it was done with care and ritual. Meat was typically boiled or stewed in clay pots, flavored with garlic, leeks, or herbs. For royal courts and temple precincts, meat flowed more freely. Fishermen, too, played a part in the realm of flesh foods. And so, in daily life, meat was both luxury and ritual. As dusk fell over a village after a feast, scraps might be laid out for household animals. Dogs barking over bones, cats licking clean a discarded fish head. Tomorrow would return to bread and beans, porridge and onions. But tonight, the rare taste of meat lingered on the tongue. If you wandered down a dusty village path at dusk, you might catch the faintest drift of sweetness on the breeze, the ripening scent of figs, hanging heavy on their broad-leaved branches, or the sticky sun-warmed smell of dates, gathered into baskets beneath stately palm trees. In the land where the Nile unspooled its life-giving flood, sweetness was a rare and treasured delight. For the ordinary Egyptian, daily food was plain, leaning heavily on bread, beans, onions, and beer. Yet here and there, nature and careful tending offered pockets of sweetness that could brighten the simplest meal or mark a day as special. For families who tended a few fig trees near their mudbrick houses, dried figs stored in baskets offered sweetness long after the harvest was done, a taste of summer in the depths of cooler months. Beekeeping was both art and labor. In sunlit courtyards or sheltered field edges, cylindrical clay hives were stacked one atop another, their ends stoppered with reeds or clay plugs. A beekeeper might puff clouds of acrid smoke to lull the hive into calm, then gently prise open the hive's end to reach the precious combs. Physicians mixed it with herbs to soothe wounds, calm coughs, or ease childbirth pains. Lavish sweetbreads were shaped and baked in animal molds, crocodiles, hippos, fish, then drizzled with honey to glisten in flickering lamplight. Tomb paintings depict servants carrying platters of sticky cakes and jars of honey sealed with reeds and clay. During the great feasts honoring gods like Hathor and Bastet, families gathered to share not just meat and beer, but offerings of fruits and honey cakes. Sweetness was both gift and promise, a token that life, though hard, could also be generous. Children learned early to look for it, to savor it slowly, to guard it as a symbol of good fortune and community goodwill. For the living and the dead alike, sweetness was proof that life could yield pleasure as well as labor. A mother opens a small reed basket and pulls out a handful of dried figs, passing them to eager hands. A father sets down a clay pot of honey, dipping a bit of barley bread into its golden pool. Laughter drifts from neighbors gathered nearby. Someone hums a tune, low and familiar. And for a few moments, the sweetness cuts through the dust, the sweat, the endless toil. It binds families together, feeds hopes for tomorrow's harvest, and reminds every soul, peasant, noble, or priest, that even in the dry heart of Egypt, the earth could still yield its hidden sweetness to those patient enough to seek it. Priests offered honey cakes to gods and spirits, their sweetness meant to please deities and ensure continued favor. Hunters and gatherers in remote edges of the Nile Valley might chance upon wild hives, their combs hidden among rocky crevices. To reach them was to risk stings, but the reward, a mouthful of raw honey, justified the peril for those who rarely tasted sugar in any other form. Even for the poor, a rare taste of honey in beer or porridge transformed a simple meal into a celebration of the Nile's gifts. Honeycomb was cut and drained into simple clay pots, sticky fingers scraping every drop from the wax cells. Beeswax, too, found its uses for sealing jars, waterproofing baskets, or in temple offerings where it symbolized purity and light. Bees buzzed in and out, drawn to wildflowers along irrigation ditches and blossoms hidden among vegetable rows. The date palm demanded patience and labor. Men climbed the rough trunks with loops of rope slung around their waists, inching up to reach the heavy clusters. A sharp knife sliced through the fibrous stem that bound each bunch together, sending it swinging down to waiting arms below. Once gathered, dates could be eaten fresh, their soft, sugary flesh filling the mouth with a richness unlike anything in the daily fare. But more often, they were dried and packed tightly in baskets, pressed into sticky cakes that travelers carried across desert roads or farmers tucked away for leaner seasons. Among the small orchard groves and garden plots, the fig tree reigned supreme. Its squat trunk and wide canopy provided welcome shade, its fruit a welcome burst of sugar on the tongue. Merchants, temple priests, and wealthier households often enjoyed more elaborate sweets. Bakers in bustling towns combined dates and figs with barley flour, kneading them into dense cakes flavored with nuts or flavored oils when available. Such confections, though humble by modern standards, were delicacies for people whose ordinary sweets came mostly from fruit plucked fresh from branch or bough. Farmers knew when to watch for the fruit to swell and split at the base, a sign the fig was ready to be plucked before insects or birds claimed it first. Children might scramble up low branches, their fingers sticky with milky sap as they tugged the soft fruit free and bit into the tender flesh. Dates, meanwhile, rose higher, tall palms swaying above fields of barley and flax. In village markets, a few copper deben might buy a handful of dates or figs, a modest indulgence for a family celebrating a birth, a wedding, or a festival day honoring Hathor, the goddess of love and plenty. Yet of all the sources of sweetness in ancient Egypt, none was more prized than honey, the golden treasure of the hive. Harvesting honey was a careful, smoky affair. Honey sweetened more than the tongue. It sweetened medicine and magic as well. At royal banquets and temple feasts, honey flowed more freely. Sometimes sweetness came unbidden. Figs stolen by children from a neighbor's grove, or wild honey found in a hollow tree far from village paths. When festivals arrived, sweets took on deeper meaning. Imagine then a warm evening as the sky fades to purple and the day's chores are done. As the pale sun drifted down the western sky, leaving the fields cloaked in the soft hush of dusk, a gentle clinking sound might echo from behind reed fences or earthen courtyards. Clay jars knocked together ladles stirring thick liquid families, gathering for the daily ritual that soothed both body and spirit, the evening sip of beer. It was food, drink, and a daily comfort, woven into the very fabric of survival beside the Nile. Where the river's silted banks gave barley in abundance, the people found a way to transform humble grain into something that could feed the hungry, lift the weary, and quench the dry tongue beneath the punishing sun. In the courtyard or the shadowed corner of a shared kitchen, a woman would spread out barley grains to dry in the sun or soak them in shallow baskets, urging them to sprout. Some families mixed this malted flour with more barley to make a thick dough, baked until half done, just enough to bind the grains and stop the sprouts from running wild. Clay jars, squat, wide-mouthed, and stained with years of use, did the job. The thick, porridge-like brew still held bits of grain that settled at the bottom of the cup, scooped up with fingers or sipped through a simple straw of reeds to catch the larger husks. Children grew up on it, not intoxicated in the modern sense, but nourished by its blend of water, carbohydrates, and a touch of warming alcohol that kept infections at bay when river water turned brackish. If one listened closely on a warm day, one could hear the faint fizz and bubble, a soft breathing of yeast as it feasted on sugar and turned grain to drink. Brewing was memory passed through generations, as familiar as mending a tunic or patching a roof. Recipes shifted from family to family. A touch of honey here, a handful of dates there, small secrets that gave each brew its own warmth and character, and patiently would yield not only grain for bread, but a draught to soften the day's edge. It was a promise that bound farmer to laborer mother, to child ruler to servant, a bond sealed each evening in the soft swirl of clay cups, the low hum of talk, and the slow drift of twilight over a land that owed its very breath to barley water and the steady unseen alchemy of yeast. When the time was right, a mother might ladle out a frothy portion, passing it to her children or husband as they gathered in the dusk after toil in the fields. They spoke of harvests and debts, of children's futures, of the Pharaoh's latest decree, and always the gentle sip of beer, bitter yeasty nourishing, carried them into night with the knowledge that tomorrow's dawn would bring the same labor, the same flood of sunlight, the same need for the steady comfort, waiting in a humble jar. These loaves were crumbled into jars, water poured over them, date juice sometimes added for sweetness, then left to sit beneath linen cloths that kept flies at bay, but let the mystery of fermentation do its invisible work. This sprouting, this gentle trick of patience and water, was the key. It turned hard grain into malt, releasing the sweetness locked inside. Brewers worked in dusty courtyards behind high mud-brick walls, tending rows of clay jars lined up like sentinels. Stonecutters, quarrymen, and farmers alike leaned on this liquid wage to wash down their bread, to ease their sunburnt throats, to keep them moving under the unrelenting sky. In tomb inscriptions, overseers note with pride the daily tally. So many jars of beer, so many loaves of bread, ensuring that hunger never turned labor to revolt. They labored under the watchful eyes of scribes, who counted each bushel of barley, each measure of date syrup, each jar sealed and marked for rations. Servants carried the brew to temples, where it was offered to the gods alongside bread and onions, a humble gift to soothe divine appetites. In ancient Egypt, beer was not an indulgence, but a necessity. To imagine this daily brew is to set aside our modern idea of beer, crisp and clear in glass bottles. Wealthier households might strain their beer more carefully, removing the gritty grains for a smoother sip. At feasts, guests reclined on low mats, cups brimming, laughter drifting into courtyards where lanterns flickered and dancers moved to the beat of drums. In these moments, beer was not just survival, it was celebration, a reminder that life, short and harsh, still offered moments to lean back and taste the sweetness of existence. Ancient Egyptian beer was something altogether different, dense, nourishing, more gruel than drink at times. Its taste carried the tang of ferment, the earthy bite of leftover grain, the faint sweetness of malted barley, coaxed into life by the warm hands of the household brewer. Most brewing was women's work, and it began at dawn, long before the heat settled onto the thatched roofs and packed earth floors. Next came the grinding, a slow and rhythmic scrape of stones that turned sprouted grain into coarse meal. In village homes, there were no polished vats or casks. For the poor, beer was more than refreshment. It was calories and comfort in one. In larger settlements and temple estates, beer making scaled up into a bustling cottage industry. Workers on grand projects, the rising spine of a pyramid, the vast walls of a temple, the irrigation canals that stitched the desert to life, received daily beer rations. There were stronger brews too, richer, darker, sometimes spiced or sweetened for festivals and funerals. Children who watched their mothers stir jars in the courtyard learned the craft early, their hands small, but eager to help mash the sprouted grain or carry water from the well. In the hush of evening, when fields lay quiet and the Nile slipped by in shadowed silence, families sat cross-legged on mats, clay cups warm in their hands. To sip beer at sunset was to taste the Nile's promise that the earth tended well. In the gentle lull between the river's morning rush and the evening hush, a fisherman's boat might drift along the shallows, its hull barely disturbing the glassy surface. Along the reedy banks, a boy with a woven basket crouched low, eyes fixed on the darting shadows beneath. For the ordinary families scattered along the Nile, fish and fowl were gifts as vital as the barley they sowed and the bread they broke. The great river was Egypt's lifeline, but it was also a teeming pantry. Beneath its muddy currents swam tilapia, catfish, mullet, slippery flashes of silver that, when caught, turned a meager meal into a small feast. In the marshes, where papyrus thickets hid shallow ponds, flocks of ducks and geese rose at dawn in noisy clouds. A quick throw of the net, a startled flutter of wings, and if luck favored, a duck or two would thrash within reach. But for the farmer's wife watching her son slip off toward the reeds, it was no grand affair. It was a chance to add meat to a stew of lentils and onions, to stretch the bread and beer with the tender flavor of roasted goose or spit-roasted quail. Some families trained tame decoy birds to lure wild flocks closer. A trick passed from father to son, a small lesson in patience and resourcefulness. They knew the calls of waiting birds at dawn, the hidden channels where fish gathered to spawn, the season when flocks passed overhead in swirling clouds that darkened the sky for an instant before settling back into the reeds. Families knew these wetlands well. They were gathering places not just for reeds and lily. A basket of salted fish might buy a length of linen for wrapping a baby, or a new clay jug when the old one cracked. A string of plump ducks could be given to a temple scribe as payment for a kind word or a lenient measure of grain tax. Even in its simplest form, fish and fowl were more than food. They were a quiet currency of survival. But for plump waterfowl, it could grace a humble table or fill an offering tray at a shrine. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another journey down the river or into the marsh, another patient wait beside the reeds. In this daily ritual, quiet, repetitive, but endlessly vital, the people of the Nile found nourishment, not just for the body, but for the hope that the river's promise would not run dry. Children waited eagerly for their piece, a strip of meat, a morsel torn free with sticky fingers, dipped into bowls of sour sauce or crumbled into stews, thickened with chickpeas or wild herbs. They'd slip into a narrow canoe, carved from sycamore or acacia, poles balanced across their knees. Even the offal, gizzards, livers, was skewered over coals, seasoned with garlic or wild coriander when available. It was a nose-to-tail feast in miniature, simple but satisfying in a world where nothing was guaranteed. It was simple work, but rewarding when the basket filled with a glimmering heap of fresh catch, enough to salt and dry on woven mats or stew in clay pots for the evening meal. In deeper channels, men cast weighted nets that spread wide in the air before falling with a muted splash, sinking beneath lily pads and river reeds. They waited, sun on their backs, listening to the slap of water against wood, feeling for the subtle tug that promised a meal. For most families, meat from livestock was a luxury rarely tasted. But fish, fresh or dried, was a humble treasure that could appear on a commoner's table when the nets were kind, and took on the tangy scent that spoke of lean days ahead. Along village paths, the smell of drying fish mixed with the scent of bread baking and beer fermenting, a pungent perfume that told any traveler this was a land where the river fed its people body and soul. A father and son might rise before the first blush of dawn to untangle the fishing lines coiled like snakes in a clay jar. Closer to shore, women and children waded in shallow pools, baskets clutched tight, feet stirring the silt to drive startled fish toward waiting hands. Fish rarely lasted long in Egypt's heat. Families preserved what they could, packing fillets in salt or drying them under the unrelenting sun until the flesh stiffened. But the Nile offered more than fish. Birds, too, were part of the daily hunt. Boys learned early how to weave simple clapnets from strips of date palm fiber, how to watch the birds' restless patterns as they gathered on sandbanks or settled into the reed beds. In richer households and temple estates, marsh hunting grew grander. Painted scenes on tomb walls show noblemen standing tall in boats, throwing boomerangs or casting nets while servants gathered the catch. When the hunt was good, a family might gather around the hearth at dusk, the scent of crisping skin mingling with wood smoke as the small fire danced in the courtyard shadows. Nothing went to waste. Bones and heads simmered into broths, feathers plucked and saved for stuffing mats or weaving simple fletchings for hunting arrows. While the pharaoh and his court feasted on choice cuts of ox and lamb, the villagers found their bounty in what they could coax from marsh and stream. Sometimes a good catch meant a small trade at the market. When night fell and families drifted to sleep on reed mats, the day's catch lay smoked or salted in jars near the hearth. When the day's work in the fields was done, and the smell of baking bread faded into the cool hush of dusk, there remained, for those who could manage it. It was precious, a rarity born from labor and the gentle cunning of nature. These hives, simple cylinders of clay or bundles of reeds bound with rope, sheltered the tiny workers who flitted from blossom to blossom, gathering the nectar that would sweeten an entire household season. Beekeepers tended these hives with careful hands, lifting sections away to coax out the thick golden comb. Each harvest was delicate. Smoke from burning dung or dry grass calmed the hive just long enough to pry the honey free without provoking an angry swarm. Women laid them in the sun to dry, turning them over so the heat coaxed out every last bit of moisture, concentrating the sugars until each fruit grew sticky and dark and nearly indestructible. Mothers shaped date cakes into simple discs, pressed with patterns using carved wooden molds or even a child's fingertip. Sometimes honey drizzled over these cakes turned a handful of fruit and flour into a delicacy worthy of the shrine. Children crowded near the hearth as the cakes baked on flat stones, their mouths watering at the promise of what might come only a few times each year. These dried dates kept for months, a treasure stored away in reed baskets, ready to brighten a bland bowl of porridge or lend depth to a thin stew. But a reminder that even the simplest meal could hold a taste of the divine, hidden in a smear of golden honey or the soft flesh of a sun-ripened date. For some, a spoonful of honey stirred into beer or spread on bread was more than food. It was a taste of luxury that reminded them of the sweetness the gods enjoyed daily in their painted halls. In lean seasons when barley ran low, a few dried dates softened in water and mashed into cakes might stand in for a meal when little else remained. For the wealthy, honey arrived in wide-mouthed pots sealed with clay and reeds, carried on donkeys from village apiaries to storerooms, stacked alongside jars of wine and oil. They would chew it slowly, savoring the way the sticky flesh clung to their teeth, sweet and rich after so much salt and grain. A child might doze off with the taste still on their tongue, dreaming of date palms rustling in the wind, of hives humming with life under the sun, of small sweetnesses that made the toil of the Nile's edge feel, for a moment, like a promise kept. But for the farmer with a handful of goats and a patch of barley sweetness came in smaller, humbler moments, a trickle of honey saved for festival bread, a handful of dates shared at the end of a long day. For the common folk, sweetness came when nature allowed and labor secured, and so they treasured it. They knew the hum of bees near clover fields, the rustle of palm fronds above sun-baked gardens, the sticky warmth of dates pressed into a child's hand at dusk. A little taste of sweetness, a gift from bees and palm trees that broke the endless salt and grain of daily fare. Sweetness in ancient Egypt was not scattered carelessly through the kitchens of common folk. Families used it sparingly, drizzled into bread dough for festival loaves or mixed with beer for special occasions. Sometimes a mother might press a dab onto her child's tongue, a tiny balm for a scratchy throat, or a reward for a chore done well. For the rest of the year, sweetness came instead from the humble date palm, swaying patiently wherever water allowed. Along the floodplains where flowering reeds and clover grew tall, bees found safe harbor in woven hives kept near gardens and orchards. And its fruit, clustered high overhead in heavy bunches, promised a sweetness that even the poorest family could taste. When the dates ripened, men climbed barefoot up the rough trunks, ropes tied about their waists, baskets slung over shoulders. They cut the ripest bunches free with knives fashioned from copper or flint, letting them tumble into waiting hands below. What honey they gathered, they strained through linen cloths, squeezing the comb to catch each sticky drop. The date palm was a generous tree. Its roots clung to the damp fringes of irrigation channels. Its fronds offered shade in the punishing sun. Dates were more than a snack. On festival days, when the gods were honored with processions of dancers, musicians, and offerings laid at temple gates, even the poor found a way to savor sweetness. For those who lived near temple estates, honey might find its way into a worker's hands as part of a ration, an extra jar for the laborer who hauled stones or cleared irrigation channels. There were no sugarcane fields to yield easy sweetness, no confections dusted in powders of white sugar. At night, as the lamps flickered and the Nile's slow breath moved beyond the courtyard walls, a family might finish their simple meal with a single dried date each. In this quiet sweetness, humble, earned, and fleeting, they found not just a break from hardship. Long before metal pots clanged in grand palace kitchens, long before copper ladles shimmered beside temple hearths, the heart of an Egyptian home lay in simple clay, the humble pots, jars, and hearthstones that turned plain grain and foraged greens into something warm enough to carry a family through another day along the river's edge. Near her feet, an earthen pot, broad-bellied, soot-kissed from countless meals, rested on a cradle of coals. There were squat jars for stewing lentils and broad-mouthed bowls for mixing bread dough. Smaller vessels with narrow necks held oil, beer, or sour milk. A simple flat baking stone served as an oven. Set directly atop the coals, it baked flatbreads that puffed. They knew which pot to place closest to the coals, how to bank the embers so a lentil stew bubbled without scorching. The sound of grain grinding was the backdrop to village life, the rhythmic scrape of stone against stone, the sigh of husks brushed aside by careful fingers. But in most households, metal was rare, costly, and often reserved for trade or tribute rather than everyday meals. A single bronze blade, if a family owned one, might be wrapped in linen and kept hidden away, brought out only for tasks that clay or flint could not manage. In this daily music, the kitchen's humble chorus blended with the calls of livestock and the low murmur of neighbors, greeting each other over courtyard walls. It was set aside to dry on a low shelf or tucked near the hearthstone to be ready at dawn, when the first glow of morning would find it waiting again, ready to cradle the simple bounty of barley, lentils, onions, fish, whatever the land, the river, and the cook's steady hands could provide. A cook knew how to flavor lentils with onions grown at the garden's edge, how to simmer dried fish with wild herbs gathered along the canals. But the daily miracle of turning earth and water grain and fish into warmth that gathered families, close against the long night carrying them to morning and the promise of another humble meal. She knew how to roast a duck caught in the marsh, how to mash dates into a thick paste to sweeten festival bread, how to brew beer that fizzed and soured, just so filling clay cups with froth that made a meal feel whole. They shaped bread loaves with quick fingers, slapping dough against hot stones or the curved inner walls of a simple dome oven built from mud and straw. There were no shelves lined with fine dishes for the common family. A flat reed tray might hold bread loaves. A simple bowl might pass from hand to hand, each child dipping a piece of bread into the stew, soaking up the last of the broth. The pot, warm and scratched, sat at the center of it all, a quiet witness to laughter, to arguments, to prayers murmured at dusk in the flicker of lamplight. Sometimes the entire family gathered to help, children fanning coals with woven mats, boys fetching water in clay jars, girls pounding grain with wooden pestles in warm mortar, and blistered under the heat, filling the yard with the warm, comforting scent of browning dough. She might stir its contents with a long reed or a stick of acacia, its charred end blackened from repeated use. There was no iron pan or shining kettle. Instead, clay did the work, shaped by calloused hands, fired in communal kilns, traded in dusty market stalls that bustled under the desert sun. Step into the courtyard of a mud-brick house at dawn, and you'd find a woman crouched low beside a small hearth, its embers shielded from the morning breeze by a ring of stones. Most families owned only a handful of cooking pots, each one a precious tool. A good clay pot was more than an object. It was a quiet companion through years of cooking. In towns and villages alike, the courtyard or corner kitchen was often no more than a shallow pit ringed with stones or hard-packed clay. Dung cakes, dry reeds, and leftover straw fed the fire, a careful balance of fuel to coax steady. Heat without wasting precious scraps that might fertilize fields or feed goats. Smoke drifted upward in thin blue threads, seeping through thatched roofs or open doorways, carrying the smell of simmering stews into narrow lanes and sunlit yards. Its belly darkened with soot and smoke, its rim chipped and mended where a careless hand knocked it against the hearth. When a pot cracked beyond repair, its shards were not discarded lightly. Broken pieces became lids, scoops, or the rough edges for scraping flour from grinding stones. Even the smallest shard might find new life, pressed into a wall to hold a wick for a tiny flame, marking time through the darkness. The hearth itself was simple, yet at its center lay the pulse of daily life. Women tended the fires with skill, taught from mother to daughter. Tools were few but essential. A grinding stone for crushing barley or emmer into coarse flour, a stone pestle for pounding spices or garlic, a woven sieve for sifting out the coarser chaff. In larger towns and on temple estates, more specialized tools might appear. Bronze knives for cutting meat or gutting fish, copper ladles for stirring beer mash, large ceramic vats for brewing or fermenting. Yet simplicity did not mean plainness. Even the smallest hearth could coax out flavors worth savoring. When the meal was ready, the same clay pots that cooked the stew often served it too. And when the meal ended and the fire burned down to glowing coals, the pot was rinsed clean with river water or a handful of sand scrub it against its inside. In these pots and hearthstones, simple yet indispensable, lay the true heartbeat of ancient Egypt's kitchens. Not grand feasts or palace banquets. When the shadows of late afternoon stretched long across the courtyard walls, and the last warmth of the sun lingered in the mudbrick, the people who labored along the Nile found their way back home, to kitchens alive with the crackle of coals, to simple mats laid out under thatched roofs, to the soft chorus of voices gathering around food that, however plain, carried them all through one more day. In the poorest village or the grandest estate, meals were not eaten alone if it could be helped. Fathers returned from the fields or canals, carrying baskets of leeks, onions, or handfuls of fish snared in reed traps. Older boys came behind with armfuls of wood or dung cakes to keep the hearth alive. Small children played at the edges of the courtyard, chasing each other between rows of clay jars, while the smell of stewing lentils drifted into the air. But in the small courtyards of farmers and craftsmen, it was the shared pot that anchored everyone, a warm, rough vessel that knew every scraped spoon and clumsy fingertip. Children interrupted with giggles or bickering, earning a soft slap on the arm or a gentle hush. Neighbors brought baskets of bread or jars of beer, and laughter rose over the courtyard walls. Stories wound into the dusk, tales of ancestors, whispered gossip of temple workers, or gossip of the noble's household up the road. In these moments, food was more than sustenance. It was proof that a family was not alone, that community. A father might lie awake beside her, counting the days until the next tax collector arrived, wondering if the barley would last, if the cattle would birth strong calves come spring. The grinding stone scraped fresh grain into flour. The hearth woke with its first crackle of smoke, and the same clay pot, rinsed clean but carrying the memory of countless meals, waited to cradle the days' food once more. Children stirred from sleep to the smell of warm bread, the soft clink of clay jars shifting as water was poured, the hushed voices of parents, already planning how to stretch what little they had until the next flood or harvest. But beneath these worries lay the small comfort of the shared meal. the knowledge that hunger was held at bay for one more night. They did not dine in gilded halls like the Pharaoh, or recline on couches like nobles drunk on wine. And long after the lamps were snuffed out and the last ember sighed into darkness, the memory of that meal lingered in the cool night air, a whisper of warmth, a taste of bread, a promise that tomorrow the pot would boil again. They gathered humbly, side by side, breathing warmth into each other's company, trusting that as long as the hearthstone glowed and the shared pot held something to give, life would continue along the river's slow, patient path, that the family circle remained unbroken by quarrel or misfortune, and kinship could turn barley and lentils into something that tasted briefly like abundance. Older daughters listened with half an ear, already thinking of tomorrow's chores, while mothers watched the pot, hoping there would be just enough left for the morning meal if the river's fish or the garden's greens fell short. The night held dangers, scorpions in the dark corners, thieves on quiet roads, spirits drifting through the open doorways if proper blessings were neglected. So families stayed close, voices softening into lullabies for restless children, quiet talk that drifted into snores, and the low hiss of embers dying in the hearth. To break bread together, to dip a hand into the same pot, to pass a piece of flatbread to a child or neighbor, was to bind a household in quiet loyalty and comfort, no matter how lean the harvest or how heavy the toil. But murmured words of thanks to the household gods, the protective spirits that watched over hearth and doorway. They learned to dip bread without wasting broth, to chew slowly so the little they had lasted longer. They learned to watch their parents' faces for signs of worry, a father counting coins by lamplight, a mother setting aside a portion of bread for tomorrow's hunger. They learned that sweetness was rare and precious, a single date pressed into a small palm, honey dripped onto festival bread, the tiny luxury that lingered long after the pot was scraped clean. Some families placed a tiny clay figure of Bes, the squat protector of homes, near the hearth. Others tucked a palm frond above the threshold, or smeared a dab of beer or honey on a lintel as an offering for good fortune. These gestures were small shields against the world's cruelty, soft prayers folded into the act of sharing food. For the ordinary family, a meal was a ritual stitched together by habit and hope, shaped by the rhythms of the river and the season's mercy. As dusk fell, mothers and daughters moved from garden plots to hearths, from pounding grain to patting dough into soft rounds that would blister and puff on hot stones. A family's meal might begin with a simple blessing, not grand hymns like those sung in temples. There was no polished table set with gleaming plates. Instead, the family gathered on reed mats or low benches if they had them, sitting cross-legged around a simple tray or woven basket that held bread and whatever stew, porridge, or dried fish the day had offered. The mother or eldest daughter portioned out food with care, tearing pieces of bread and handing them to each family member. Sometimes a simple clay bowl of stew would pass from hand to hand, each dipping a chunk of bread, scooping up lentils or greens, careful not to spill precious broth onto the dusty floor. In wealthier households, servants might ladle food into separate bowls or spread a cloth with baskets of dates, onions, or boiled eggs. Conversation drifted easily through the meal, a father asking how the goats fared, whether the barley seemed healthy, whether a neighbor's child was still ill. Sometimes, when the harvest was good or a festival drew near, the meal stretched beyond the family. For children, the meal was lesson and comfort at once. When the food was gone, the scraps of bread swept away, and the last sip of beer drained from clay mugs, the family did not linger far from the hearth. A mother might sit up late, mending a torn linen tunic by the glow of a single lamp, the same lamp that had watched the family eat together hours before. The next morning, when dawn bled through the courtyard walls, the rituals began again. In this endless rhythm, grain to bread, bread to stew, pot to hearth, family to mat, the ancient Egyptians wove their daily strength. To eat together was to hope together, a ritual older than pyramids, softer than hymns, stronger than the shifting Nile. When the last scraps of bread were eaten, and the hearth's heat dwindled to an ember, soft pulse, the ancient Egyptian night did not always fold into silence. Instead, it often swelled with a hush of music, a ripple of laughter, a low voice spinning a story older than the grandfather who told it, a warmth that glowed even when the fire sank to coals. In the humble courtyard of a farmer's house, entertainment was never grand, yet it was as necessary as food. After days spent bent over barley fields, or straining their backs hauling river water, the people of the Nile leaned into the dusk for comfort. Not every home had one, but if a neighbor did, he might wander in, instrument tucked under his arm, welcomed with a cup of thin beer and a warm spot on the reed mat. No stage, no curtain, just the hush of the courtyard and the hush of neighbors drawing near. The first notes were soft, barely lifting above the rustle of night insects and the distant bark of dogs guarding cattle pens. He leaned back on an elbow, pointing a gnarled finger at the children when the story turned sharp. Listen, eh? Remember this when the river runs low. Eyes widened in the flickering lamplight, the younger ones half afraid of the demons and half enchanted by them. By the time the story's hero triumphed, eyelids sagged, but the memory nestled itself in the corners of young minds, seeds to be carried into their own dusk years later. Not the great dances of festival processions, but a simple stamping of feet on packed earth, hands clapping in time, a line of neighbors swaying shoulder to shoulder. Now and then, a mother would hush a child's squeal if it rose too sharp, worried it might draw an unseen ear. The storyteller fell silent. The last notes of a flute curled into the thatched roof. A half-finished joke to carry into tomorrow's field. A line of song hummed under a breath while lifting baskets of grain. A story passed along to another child or cousin when the work slowed just enough to let memory bloom. Children were lifted, half asleep, to pallets of woven reeds, their hair still smelling of smoke and warm air. Parents lingered by the hearth, banked the coals for the next morning's spark, and whispered over plans for tomorrow's planting or trading. A father tossed a pinch of beer to the ground, an offering to restless ancestors or wandering ghosts who might listen from the garden's edge. The stories, the music, the laughter, there were also small fires to keep the cold touch of the unknown at bay. A gentle promise that even in a land where the sun burned and the taxes weighed heavy and the river sometimes failed to flood, there would always be a song, a story, a bit of laughter to hold back the dark. In these moments, the courtyard stretched wider than its walls, the weight of work forgotten for a breath or two. Children leaned in, eyes wide, their legs tucked beneath them, as if afraid to break the spell with a careless kick of dust. A clever man might tease his brother about a stubborn donkey, or a neighbor might nudge the village potter about pots that cracked before they cooled. Sometimes an older child mimicked the priests at the temple, or strutted around like a pompous noble, drawing cackles and a playful swat from an uncle's reed switch. Women, pounding grain at the edge of the gathering, hid smiles behind hands, their giggles spilling into the warm dark. Even the smallest joke lightened the burden of days spent hunched over work, gathering up bits of joy as carefully as they gathered up stray seeds from the threshing floor. Some were lessons tucked into the shape of a tale, how the sly jackal outwitted the careless farmer, how the crocodile taught a foolish boy not to trespass too close to the reeds. Others were grander echoes of myths that once filled temple walls with painted scenes, tales of Isis searching for Osiris, of Ra sailing the sunboat across the sky of Set, lurking in the dark with trickery coiled beneath his skin. Sometimes it began with a simple instrument. A father might lift a small wooden flute, its surface worn smooth where his fingers knew just where to press. A song might imitate the call of river birds, the lapping of water against boat hulls, the soft sigh of wind through palm fronds. Children clapped softly, hands muffled by the dusk. Older ones might tap a simple rhythm on a clay jar or slap a poem against a bare thigh, building a heartbeat under the song. A reed pipe, a simple lyre of string pulled tight across a hollow shell. These were the treasures of village nights. A few gentle notes grew into a melody. Nothing complex, nothing royal or grand. When the music paused, stories rose in its place. A grandfather's voice cracked like dry reeds, but the words were whole, drifting around the family like a woven blanket. Sometimes laughter rose louder than the stories. Jokes old as the fields found new life when shared among neighbors who knew each other's flaws and failings. Children, never far from mischief, invented games in the dim light, a race around the courtyard stones, a chase that ended in a tangle of arms, and squeals until the mother's sharp whisper calmed them down. And if the night was long enough, and the fields had been kind, there might be a dance. Yet, even these small joys carried a hush beneath them, a quiet respect for the dark and the spirits that stirred in its shadows. When at last weariness settled into bones like silt in a slow river, the circle drifted apart. Even then, fragments of the night's laughter clung to them like the smell of cooking fires on their clothes. And so, in the smallest courtyard or the grandest villa, these simple evenings threaded a quiet magic through daily life. In the ancient Egyptian world, life was not counted by the days alone, nor by the turning of stars overhead, but by the steady breath of the Nile, a single eternal pulse that rose, spread its gift, then pulled back into itself once more. First, there was the waiting, that tense hush in the dry months when the land cracked under the sun's sharp gaze. Mothers dipped fingers into the rising edge, lifting drops to their brows as if to bless the seeds yet to be sown. Boys splashed along the edges, squealing at the touch of new water, while their fathers called them back with mock sternness. Fields turned to dust, cattle gathered near shrinking pools, and people shaded their eyes to the south, toward the heart of the river's mystery. A father might wade knee-deep into the new water, scattering barley into its murk as both test and gift, trusting the river to hold the seed until the flood withdrew, leaving behind rich dark mud where roots would grip. Women pressed bits of bread into the flood's edge, calling for protection for their children and good harvests for the village granary. Songs rose in the fields, soft and rhythmic, keeping the beat of hoes striking earth and baskets passing from hand to hand. In village shrines, clay lamps flickered before carved figures of gods who cradled sheaves of grain. Offerings of onions, garlic, fish, and beer changed hands, feeding the divine as they fed the mortal. Each flood was a rebirth, each retreat a promise kept, each ritual a small human voice saying, "We see you, we thank you, come again." And so, the seasons passed like slow, quiet breaths, a lullaby sung in silt and water, carrying families from one year into the next under the watching stars. Even the humblest farmer kept a scrap of cloth tied to a post, a simple nod to unseen forces that could make or break a family's hope with a single fickle rise or fall of water. Stories of floods past mingled with plans for marriages, births, and the simple counting of days until the next harvest. Meals were shared in courtyards, lit by soft lamp glow. Stories told of floods long ago, some so generous they carried wealth to every doorstep, some so cruel they washed away entire villages in a single moon's passing. In the telling, people reminded themselves that they were only guests here. The river, forever, was the true master. And though the sun pressed down, the people bent their backs with a quiet faith that the river would remember them next year too. Children were sometimes scolded for splashing too wildly, reminded that these waters were not just play, they were sacred veins of life. Stories passed from mouth to mouth about the mountains far beyond sight, where hidden rains and melting snows stirred the waters that would soon arrive. Villagers climbed onto simple rafts or guided narrow skiffs between fields, that for a short while became islands. Boys leaned over the sides to watch fish flicker among submerged stalks. Old men poked at the water with sticks, judging how deep the silt might be this year. Women, careful not to tip baskets into the current, ferried food and supplies from house to house, laughter and gossip floating with them over the ripple of floodwaters. This yearly flood was not just a river's habit. Now the true work began. Families took up simple plows and wooden hoes. Oxen pulled rough blades through the softened earth, while children scattered seeds by hand, bare feet pressing them deeper into the mud. The air smelled of damp soil and fresh promise. It was the mother's milk for every field, the silent promise that grain would grow and life would endure. Priests watched too, standing near temples that rose above the river like guardians. They measured the water with millimeters, stone columns carved with marks to tell how generous the river's heart would be. Too little, and hunger would follow. Too much, and homes might vanish under brown, roiling currents. Each mark whispered its own omen. Each step up the column an invitation to hope or fear. And around its coming and going, an entire rhythm of ritual and quiet devotion wove its way through village lanes and palace courts alike. The flood's return was not sudden. When the first signs came, the river darkening with silt, the banks swelling in the night, the people watched like children waiting for a father's boat on the horizon. But it was not only the villagers who marked the flood. When the flood crested and began to spill across the flat fields, families turned their eyes to the gods. Offerings were brought to shrines both grand and humble. In great temples, priests in white linen lifted trays of bread, beer, and lotus, flowers to Hapi, the god of the inundation, his belly round like the river's promise, his skin painted blue and green like the fertile banks. Incense curled into the warm air, thin ribbons of scent that carried prayers upward to drift among the painted ceilings. In small homes, families made their own quiet rituals. As the weeks passed, the water settled its claim, spreading thin fingers into every furrow and hollow. And then, as steadily as it rose, the flood began to slip away, leaving behind a land dressed in black soil. Kemet, they called it the Black Land, reborn each year from the river's retreat. Though the labor was backbreaking, there was always a hum beneath it, a hymn to the river's gift. The seasons turned, from flood to planting to harvest to waiting again. Rituals big and small marked each turn. When the harvest finally filled baskets and granaries, families gathered to thank the river and the gods once more. So the Nile's rhythm held the people in its wide embrace, marking not just time, but the very shape of their days and dreams. If you were to slip quietly through an ancient Egyptian village at sunrise, following the winding path from mudbrick homes to the beating heart of daily life, you would find yourself at the market, long before the sun turned the air heavy with its heat. Here, under woven awnings or the sparse shade of date palms, life pulsed with chatter and barter, a gentle chaos where news and grain, spices and gossip, all changed hands beneath the watchful eyes of carved gods perched on small roadside shrines. The market was not grand, not like the ceremonial avenues of Thebes or the bustling docks at Memphis. But in each humble village, it was the place where the world felt bigger than a single household. The girl's eyes widened, imagining how it might feel cool against her neck on festival days. And gather the days whispers. Whose son was to marry the brewer's daughter? For a few copper deben, he would scratch out a letter to a cousin 3 villages away, or read aloud a message from a soldier stationed near the Red Sea. His reed brush dipped in black ink danced over the page while children peeked over his shoulder, wide-eyed at the mystery of marks that could bind words across distance. His voice rose and fell, weaving tales of clever foxes and bumbling crocodiles, the crowd answering his pauses with laughter or hushed gasps. For a moment, the hum of barter faded into this single thread of wonder, a reminder that markets sold more than food. They traded in tales and dreams, carrying news and myth from ear to ear. Who found a snake in their grain jar? Who paid too little tribute to the temple, and now faced the priest's stern frown? Bits of chaff and broken potsherds marked where stalls once stood. Children lingered, digging in the dust for a dropped bead or shiny shell. And as the village exhaled, its people turned homeward, arms filled with onions, bread, new gossip, the soft weight of another day's trade, carrying them through the hush of dusk. Beneath a rough canopy of reeds, a young boy crushed herbs and resin with a stone pestle for the healer's stall. It was the village's slow heartbeat, a soft, steady reminder that even the smallest corner of the black land was tied by trade, tale, and shared hunger for tomorrow. He paused to swipe sweat from his brow as an old woman asked for a pinch of dried mint to soothe her cough. Children's cheeks flushed pink as they darted between stalls, clutching a fig or a sweet roll, always a step ahead of a scolding shout. Argans grew softer now. Voices dropped to murmurs as families weighed whether to spend the last coin on saltfish or save it for lamp oil. Chickens clucked around her feet, hoping for a dropped grain. Donkeys, lighter now, stomped hooves against the dust. Families gathered what remained, wrapping unsold goods in woven cloths. With parting nods, traders headed homeward, some with pockets heavier, some with only enough to keep hope alive for the next week's market. Gossip floated like incensed smoke, drifting from stall to stall, woven into bargains and half-truths alike. The merchant leaned in, voice soft but persuasive, swearing the beads were blessed under the full moon, that they would keep away fevers and jealousy. If the price felt too high, the mother might tilt her head, pretend to turn away, a signal to lower the price with a knowing grin. In this small dance of give and take, value is measured not just in coins, but in charm and patience. Traders from neighboring hamlets arrived with donkeys piled, high with rough woven cloth or freshly harvested dates, still warm from the morning sun. Some came by narrow boat, poling quietly up the canals, baskets balanced on bent knees, eyes flicking left and right for a spot to dock. Before dawn's blush, families rose in their cool courtyards, tying baskets of onions, beans, lentils, and dried fish. Sweet wafts of honey cakes, and the sharp tang of goats and chickens shifting in rope-tied clusters at the edge. Merchants spread rush mats on the packed earth, laying out their wares in careful rows. Bright faience beads glowed beside clay figurines of household gods, tiny bas figures to guard a home, or amulets shaped like the eye of Horus, winking up at passers-by. Children stumbled sleepily behind parents, carrying jars of beer or clay pots of thick, fragrant stew to sell or trade. By the time the sun's rim peered over the flat roofs, voices already mingled with the calls of herons at the river's edge. The market smell was an orchestra of human life, pungent garlic and leeks baskets of pungent fish drying in the warmth. A mother might pause, tugging her daughter's hand as she examined a necklace of glazed blue stones. Not all came to sell. Some came just to listen, to stand in a shaded corner along the market's edge. An old scribe sat cross-legged with his papyrus roll. Here, too, were wandering craftsmen, the potter offering small oil lamps and sturdy water jugs, the cobbler willing to stitch a cracked sandal while you waited. Near the center, a small knot of people gathered at a storyteller's feet. Toward midday, the heat thickened. Traders wiped brows with the edges of linen headcloths. When the shadows shortened and the sun pressed down, baskets emptied one by one. Behind them, the market square settled into quiet again. So the market was more than a place to buy and sell. When you slip away from the clamor of the village market and drift down a narrow lane lined with mud brick walls, you may find a shaded courtyard where the scratching of a reed pen is the loudest sound in the midday hush. His tools are simple: a slender reed pen trimmed to a fine nib, a palette of 2 cakes of ink, black for words, red for headings and corrections. Sometimes his work is to copy prayers for a temple wall, sacred lines that must be drawn just so, each curve of a hieroglyph alive with meaning, every tiny owl or coiled snake a whisper of power. Other times, his pen finds its home in more humble tasks, recording the measure of barley owed to a landlord, drafting contracts for marriage dowries, tallying livestock before tax collectors arrive. Beside him sits a roll of fresh papyrus, the pale sheets made from the sliced pith of river reeds pressed. She slips it into the fold of her dress, pressing it to her chest, as if it might carry her warmth across the desert winds. He hums to himself, a low song that keeps the pace steady, each mark no thicker or thinner than the last. He copies old proverbs from brittle scrolls, wisdom handed down like a lamp, passed from one hand to the next. Or he sketches tiny illustrations in the margins. A beetle here, a lotus flower there, small tributes to the beauty he sees while sitting so still. If he is bold, he might write a line of praise for his own craft. A clay lamp flickers beside him as he leans back, eyes drifting to the slow arc of stars above the rooftops. Somewhere, far across the fields, a plowman sings a lullaby to his children. A temple drum beats softly in the distance. And in the hush of ink and paper, the scribe holds the village's memory safe, proof that words once set down can linger like footprints long after the voices that shaped them have faded into sleep. A nod to the secret pride that even pharaohs and priests must bend their heads to the scribe, sand when they wish their deeds to last beyond their own fleeting breath. He sits cross-legged by the scribe's feet, muttering of a boundary dispute, one neighbor's goat slipping too often onto another's patch of beans. The scribe listens, patient, pen hovering, until the tale untangles itself into clear lines of ownership, each word a small shield against quarrel. A few will beg him to show them how a single curl of the pen can become a hawk, or a wave, or the looping coil of a snake. He might smile, tear a scrap from the edge of a used sheet, and guide a young hand in the first clumsy swirl of a glyph. A tiny spark is planted, the hope that one day they too might sit at a low wooden desk, head bowed over secrets made of ink. He writes it all in black strokes on fresh papyrus, a neat record that will rest in a clay jar at the temple storehouse, waiting to be summoned if tempers rise. A young woman brings him a slip of coin to pen a letter for her brother, who labors far upriver. She dictates haltingly, eyes on her hands, words tumbling in a rush of missing him and hoping for news of the coming flood. He rises then, stretching arms stiff from hours spent hunched over the page. The last rays of the sun slip between the courtyard walls, gilding his tools in honey light. He tidies each one with care, the reed pens laid in a row, the ink cakes wrapped against the night's damp air, the scraps of rejected papyrus brushed into a small clay bowl. The scribe writes, head bowed, voice calm, as he repeats each phrase back to her, so she might hear her own heart made solid in ink. If he makes a mistake, he pauses, leans back, studies the papyrus in the good light of the courtyard. Then a flick of his wrist lifts a fine scrap of sand or a dab of water to blot away the error before it dries. His fingers smell faintly of resin and ink, the scents clinging to his skin like memories, and dried under the sun until they grow stiff enough to cradle the weight of ink. Here sits the scribe, the quiet keeper of Egypt's daily memory, while the plowman's gift is in the furrowed earth, and the priestess' gift is in coaxing favor from the gods. The scribe's gift is in the steady flow of ink across papyrus, binding thought to paper so it might live beyond the day it was spoken. His desk is no grand thing, a low stool beside a small stand of polished wood, warm and smooth from years of resting elbows and brush handles. He wakes before dawn, when the air is still soft and the shadows long. To watch him write is to watch a dance, the pen dipping, lifting, trailing ink in careful lines. People come and go, stepping quietly into his shade with messages they cannot trust to their own lips alone. When the letter is done, he rolls the papyrus tight and seals it with a twist of cord and a dab of clay pressed with his tiny seal. Sometimes it is the village elder who comes, with a frown deepening the lines of his brow. In the quietest moments, when no villagers wait with worries or dreams, the scribe sometimes writes for himself. Near his desk, a pot of water stands ready to wet his brush or wash the ink from his fingers when dusk comes creeping in. Children sometimes peek through the doorway as he works, eyes wide at the sight of words taking shape from nothing. When night comes, the scribe's courtyard is quiet once more. The last roll of papyrus is tucked away. When the sun slides down behind the flat line of the desert, taking with it the scorching press of the day, the village that seemed dusty and weary under the heat slowly comes alive again. Lanterns flicker into life, tiny yellow stars strung from doorposts and wooden beams. On nights like this, the cares of barley yields and family squabbles are set aside. Instead, the people of this small bend in the Nile gather under the hush of stars to share wine, laughter, songs. The smell of roasting fish mingles with the sharp sweetness of dates and the yeasty tang of fresh beer, a simple brew ladled out from broad clay jars into small cups made from coiled leaves. Children weave between the grown-ups, sticky fingers clutching scraps of honey cake, eyes wide at the promise of staying awake long past the usual bedtime, heaped with garlands of wildflowers and tiny offerings. Bowls of milk, a handful of pomegranate seeds, a wedge of soft cheese. They sway at first, bodies catching the pulse of the drums that thud like a second heartbeat. One carries a pair of small bronze cymbals, which chime softly with each spin. Another raises her arms high, fingers curved like lotus petals, her shadow flickering huge against the courtyard walls. Their movements tell the stories the elders whisper, a dance of the flood's arrival, of the marriage of earth. A single flute calls out a high, clear melody, answered by the steady chant of the crowd. The words are older than memory, prayers that once coaxed the river to rise, that once promised safe passage to ancestors who drifted west into the desert beyond death. He speaks of the river, of the promise that it will come again to feed the fields, of the gods who guard the village as breath each night when the world slips closest to the edge of dream. He offers a final blessing over the bowls of leftover food, a reminder that even the scraps belong to the cycle, that nothing given to the gods is truly wasted. The young ones do not know every line, but they hum along, catching the shape of the tune as it curls through the dark air. Tomorrow they will rise to tend goats, to weave mats, to mend nets, to scratch the earth for its meager gifts. But for tonight, under the soft hush of the stars and the final whisper of embers, they are fed in body and spirit, reminded that sometimes for a single night, a village can shine brighter than all the cold glitter of the desert sky. And river, of the hidden gods who slip unseen through doorways when the world is half asleep. Little ones nod off on their mothers' laps, warm cheeks pressed against the soft linen of skirts. The brazier burns lower, snapping sparks into the air that swirl upward like fleeting wishes. Here the villagers leave their whispered thanks and shy petitions, clay amulets pressed with the eye of Horus' tiny carved scarabs that mothers buy to tie to their children's wrists for protection. Young men lift baskets of sand overhead, boasting to win the favor of giggling girls. Older boys challenge one another to riddles that twist the tongue, each wrong answer met with peals of laughter and mock groans. A circle forms around two friends who wrestle playfully in the dust, their limbs gleaming with sweat, the crowd clapping in time with their grappling struggle. The scribe is there too, his reed pen traded tonight for a small drum. He sits cross-legged, tapping out a gentle beat to guide the dancer's feet, his eyes bright in the flicker of the brazier. A mother touches her forehead to the table's edge, murmuring for strong crops this year. A boy kneels, eyes shut tight, asking that his father's boat return safely from its trading voyage downstream. Clay jugs of wine make slow circuits through the gathering, poured into small cups that seem never quite empty. Here and there, Laughter turns loud and wild as the wine works its warmth through tired limbs and sunburned skin, and the hush of half-remembered prayers, whispered to old gods whose names have been spoken for more centuries than anyone here can count. Somewhere near the temple courtyard, drums begin to speak, low, rhythmic pulses that echo off mudbrick walls and drift across the fields where reeds whisper in the night breeze. The men wear simple white kilts, freshly washed and stiff with new starch, the linen catching firelight in soft folds. The women wear necklaces of painted beads, tinkling softly as they walk, their hair oiled and combed smooth, sometimes adorned with a single bloom of blue lotus tucked behind an ear. Tonight is not just any evening. It is a festival night, a pause in the long cycle of toil and hunger and waiting for the river's mercy. You might see families drift in from the shadows, lanterns bobbing like fireflies in their hands, tales of clever crocodiles who tricked greedy hunters, or of a hawk who flew so high he pecked the sun, only to tumble down in a rain of sparks that became the desert stars. These stories are old as the sand, yet tonight they feel fresh, woven anew each time a child gasps or a woman covers her mouth to hide her smile. At the heart of the village square, a great clay brazier crackles, fed with dry reeds and scraps of old wood carried down from the riverbank. Near the brazier, elders squat on woven mats, voices drifting in low bursts of laughter as they recount the same stories they have told each festival night for decades. Somewhere to the side, a small shrine gleams in the flickering light, a modest wooden table draped in woven cloth. Then come the dancers, young men and women stepping barefoot into the circle of firelight. On the edges of the festival, traders spread blankets of trinkets and dried fruits, bracelets strung with cowrie shells. There are games, too, simple contests of strength and wit. All the while, food passes from hand to hand. Soft bread torn into pieces to soak up bowls of lentil stew spiced with garlic and herbs. As the night deepens, songs take the place of spoken stories. Some elders grow quiet, leaning back on rolled mats, eyes fluttering shut as the drums slow to a sleepy heartbeat. A priest in a simple white robe lifts his hands over the shrine, voice soft but sure. When the last drumbeat fades, the villagers drift homeward through the hush of pre-dawn, carrying the warm fullness of shared food, shared stories, shared hope. Long before the sun warms the clay roofs of the village, before the first goats stir from their rough pens and the river's fog lifts like a slow exhale, there is always someone awake. Bundles of drying leaves hang from the ceiling beams, like upside-down forests. Clay jars crowd every ledge and corner, each marked with careful symbols so she knows which holds powdered root, which keeps scorpion oil, which cradles the fine gray ash of burned reeds that can draw poison from a wound. She is neither priest nor scribe nor farmer, yet her presence threads quietly through every household here. She is the village healer, an old woman whose small house sits a little apart, tucked behind a tangle of reeds. The healer frowns, but wastes no words. She takes down a jar filled with dark oil, thick as river mud, and a small, sharp knife chipped from black flint. With careful hands, she slices a thin line across the swollen skin, just enough to let the poison weep out. She packs the wound with a mash of garlic and crushed river shells, binding it tight with a scrap of clean linen boiled over her brazier for just such needs. The girl winces, but does not cry out. She leaves with a limp, a clay token tied to her wrist to keep the snake's spirit from circling back. They say that when she was young, she lay for 3 days in a fever, so fierce that her mother wept beside her reed mat. And when she rose again, her eyes were different, deep as river pools. And the first boats drift by with fishermen calling to each other in drowsy voices. She gathers up her tools. She rinses her bowls and knives in the river's edge, washing away the night's sickness and sorrow so they do not linger. She breathes in the hush of morning, the cool promise of another day's labor. Then she turns back to her house, Her garden, her waiting jars, ready for the next knock at her door, the next secret hurt to soothe, the next life to mend as best she can, with nothing more than river silt bone splinters and the old songs that hum quietly in her tired heart. From that day, she spoke to things no one else could hear. True or not, no one questions the story. In a place where the river gives life and takes it back without warning, who would dare? And a fence made from driftwood gathered at the Nile's edge. She wraps the baby in linen, murmurs blessings, coaxes the mother, spreath back with roots steeped in wine, and quick words that sound half like prayers, half like promises to some small god that lives only in her mind. When the old grow weary and ready to slip away, she sits beside them, a bowl of sweet-smelling resin burning low to keep the air clean her fingers, resting lightly on thin wrists until the final sigh comes and goes. She knows which leaves cure belly pain, which roots calm the trembling of fear after a nightmare. Someone has come by stealth, a man whose wife cannot carry a child, or a mother desperate to ease the restless dreams that haunt her son. They bring coins when they can, a fish or a string of beads when they cannot. She never refuses them. She listens, nods, rummages through her shelves of jars and bundles. Sometimes she gives them only words, a charm to bury under a doorway, a line of song to hum beside a restless sleeper's ear. She gathers beetles for their shells, dry frogs for their skins, dry seeds that rattle like old bones in their clay jars. Sometimes she slips down to the river to stand ankle-deep in its slow flow, whispering to the water as if it were an old friend. She cups her hands to scoop up silt, rich with life, and presses it into small pots where new seeds will sprout. If you walk the dusty path to her door at dawn, you will find the air thick with the scents of bruised herbs and smoldering incense. Inside her house it is cool, always dim, the windows shaded by woven mats that keep the fierce sun from spoiling her precious stores. She sees what the temple does not, the secret hurts, the fears that hide in the dark places of the mind. She knows which child has begun to slip into the other world too soon, which family hoards a sickness they would rather bury than confess to the gods. She keeps these secrets locked in her heart, a vault of whispered woes that she carries without complaint. A cat slips silently through the shadows at her feet, a silent guardian, eyes glinting when they catch the morning light. A father brings his feverish child, eyes wide with worry. She feels the small, burning brow, listens for the rasp of breath, and nods to herself. Into a mortar, she drops a twist of dried mint, a pinch of bitter bark, shaved from a tree that grows near the river's bend, and a few grains of salt from the edge of the flooded fields. Her hands are old, but sure as they grind and mix, whispering words under her breath. Not quite prayer, not quite spell, but something older that hums in her bones. Chickens cluck in a corner pen, kept out for eggs alone, but for the tiny bones she sometimes needs for charms and cures, whispered down from mothers and grandmothers before her. The villagers come in a quiet stream. They do not knock, for her door stands open at all hours. The paste she smears on a strip of linen. She shows the father how to bind it around the child's wrists and ankles, where the pulse beats strongest. She presses a clay cup into his hand, a mild brew of reeds steeped in honey and river mint, and sends him home with a final touch to the boy's forehead. A blessing, simple as a sigh. Next comes a young woman, shyly lifting her skirt to reveal a snake bite, 2 angry punctures darkening her ankle. In the quiet hours between visitors, the healer tends her garden, a jumble of reeds, desert herbs, tiny bitter melons creeping along woven fences. At night, when the village settles into its hush of sleep, her hut often glows with a thin sliver of light. Though her hands are old and her back bent, the villagers trust her more than they trust the scribes with their reeds and ledgers, more than the priests with their polished prayers. Some say she is half-spirit herself, that she knows the hidden paths where the dead slip by moonlight to whisper in her dreams. When a birth goes wrong, she is there. hand steady even when blood runs hot over her palms. At the first light of dawn, when the birds stir in the reeds. Long before wine became a mark of royal luxury, the true drink of the people of ancient Egypt was beer. Not the golden fizzy kind poured into pint glasses today, but a thick hearty brew, somewhere between a drink and a meal in itself. To step into the daily life of an ancient Egyptian brewer is to step into the slow rhythmic heartbeat of the village. A mash of barley flour and emmer is mixed with water and a little yeast left over from previous batches. She stirs the mushy mix with a long wooden paddle. Sometimes she adds crushed dates or figs for sweetness. There is no hurry. And those big, rounded jars that keep the beer cool and safe in the shade. For children, mixed with extra water for a safe drink when the river's edge turns foul. Workers receive jars daily, fueling the labor that raises monuments skyward. There is always something to watch. A batch that goes too sour in the summer heat. A clay pot that cracks and leaks its precious cargo onto the earthen floor. She patches and seals with clay, sets new loaves to bake, stirs the mash. Brewing is a cycle as steady as the Nile flood. Sow, harvest, bake, soak, strain, ferment. Beer is not just a drink in ancient Egypt. It is the heartbeat of the common home, the daily toast to survival, and the taste of earth and river combined. In every humble sip, the brewer's quiet work lives on, bubbles rising gently to greet the night. One jar is opened while another waits its turn. It is a calorie-rich, nourishing drink that softens the bite of hunger and keeps the spirit steady through the drudgery of hauling stone under the relentless Egyptian sun. For priests who pour it as offerings to the gods and to the spirits of the ancestors. And for the dead who carry jars of beer to the afterlife, painted carefully on tomb walls to ensure an eternal supply. Friends gather on reed mats, clay cups in hand, laughing and telling stories. Children sneak sips when mothers look away. The taste is strong, earthy, sour-sweet, with bits of grain still swirling at the bottom of the cup. It is not elegant, but it is beloved, a symbol of life's simple abundance. She seals each jar with clay or reeds, marking the date in her mind. There are no written labels here, only memory and the taste of experience. Fermentation is alive. It listens to the air and the warmth of the day. As she works, she watches for bubbles, that soft fizz that whispers of yeast waking up and transforming grain to beer. She kneads the sticky dough, humming softly as she folds and presses the cool clay floor beneath her feet. Small children peek in to steal scraps of dough to chew while they play. Nearby, a clay oven glows with embers. The dough goes in for a short bake, just enough to firm the outer crust while leaving the inside soft and moist. She eats her bread dipped in beer soup, flavored with garlic and onions. She watches the stars emerge over the palms that sway along the river's edge. The jars stand quiet in the shadows, their hidden magic working overnight, turning grain to drink, labor to comfort, effort to warmth in the belly. Where clay jars line cool mudbrick walls, and the scent of yeast and grain drifts softly on the breeze from the Nile. In the hush of dawn, when the river mists still cling to the banks, the brewer rises. Often a woman is brewing was mostly household work done by wives and mothers. She ties back her linen headcloth, pulls her plain tunic snug around her waist, and steps into her workspace, an open courtyard or the shaded back room of a home. Here, the grains rest in woven baskets, carefully gathered from the recent harvest. Some have simple reed lids to keep the flies out. Others are stopped with plugs of linen. When the mash reaches the right point, just enough tongue on the tongue, she ladles the thick liquid through woven sieves to catch the rough lumps of bread and husks. The strained beer pours slowly into jars, thick like porridge, cloudy with yeast and grain. Nothing is wasted. The leftover mash might go to feed animals or even thicken other dishes in the kitchen. Barley and emmer wheat, the two grains that sustained Egypt's people for thousands of years. wait for their transformation. The first step is the bread. Brewing begins with baking, but this bread is not for the table. Once cooled, these half-baked loaves are torn apart and soaked in big clay vats filled with warm water. Beside her, large, broad-mouthed jars stand ready. A brewer's tools are humble but essential. Baskets for grain, clay ovens, broad fermentation vats. Beer is for everyone, for workers in the fields who drink it with onion bread under the blistering sun. At the great building sites, temples, tombs, massive stone walls, beer rations are as important as bread. Back in the village, the brewer's day moves slowly as the jars ferment. At feasts and celebrations, beer flows freely. At day's end, the brewer sits with her family near the hearth. In this ancient rhythm, a single brewer links harvest to hunger, land to life, gods to people. Step through the high stone gateway of an ancient Egyptian temple, and you step into a world set apart from the dusty bustle of village streets. Here, cool shadows linger under towering pylons carved with prayers and victories, and rows of reed baskets brimming with grain, onions, leeks, and garlic bulbs. The cooks, men carefully trained and purified for this sacred task, light small fires under broad clay stoves. Sparks dance in the pre-dawn dark. The first pots of water are lifted from cool cisterns and set to heat, while baskets of fresh vegetables are gathered from temple gardens just outside the walls. Fresh loaves of bread are molded by hand, each marked with small impressions to distinguish sacred loaves from daily rations. They carry the trays in solemn processions to the inner sanctum, where statues of the gods sit in darkness behind carved doors. Here, the offerings are laid out, loaves stacked high, beer jars uncorked, cuts of meat arranged neatly. The air grows heavy with incense and chanting. This is not mere nourishment. This is a transaction, a daily promise between humans and the divine. Honey cakes are drizzled with thick golden syrup, sticky and fragrant. These gardens are tended by another class of temple workers who draw water from canals, fed by the Nile steady pulse. Leeks, cucumbers, onions, lettuce, and herbs grow under the watchful eyes of scribes who tally each harvest on smooth limestone flakes. The fires glow low, the cooks rest on stone benches, and the soft coo of pigeons drifts in through open courtyards. But even then, there is work. Pickling vegetables in brine-filled jars, mashing garlic and herbs into pastes, preparing dried fish for the next day's feast. All is done carefully, with a sense that every action echoes into eternity. Dates are mashed into sweet pastes, pressed into small molds, and set aside on reed mats to firm up in the shade. And ducks tied by their feet, sacks of grain, dried fruits, and honeycombs wrapped in reeds to keep the bees away. In this ancient kitchen behind holy doors, the bond between people and gods is renewed, one simple meal at a time. Scribes stand at the gates counting every item, marking them with ink on scrolls. These gifts are carried once more to the sanctuary. The temple gates close for the night. Within the thick stone walls, the gods are fed, the priests are full, the cooks have done their sacred work. The temple kitchen is not just a kitchen. It is a vital node in an economic network that ties farmers, fishermen, herders, and royal storehouses together. Wheat, barley, figs, honey, and meat, wrapped in palm leaves, wait in orderly piles, ready to become offerings. But this is no simple household hearth. This kitchen feeds not only the priests and temple staff, who serve day and night, but also the gods themselves. Or rather, they are carried back to the kitchen, divided among the priests, the temple workers, the scribes who record the accounts, and the guards who keep watch at the gates. This redistribution keeps the temple community fed and loyal. Back and forth, the heavy stone slides, turning hard kernels to fine flour. Others mind the fires, adding bundles of reeds or palm sticks to keep the embers alive. A few are trusted with the spice jars, small clay containers holding precious coriander seeds, dill, and salt harvested from dry desert lakes. The gods, it is believed, have taken the essence of the food, its life force, leaving the physical meal behind for the faithful. Their statues, their symbols, the stone and wood forms that must be fed to keep order and harmony between earth and the divine. Ashes from the hearth are swept away and stored. Nothing from a sacred space is discarded carelessly. Broken clay pots are crushed for reuse. Animal bones are collected for tools or ground into powder for rituals and medicine. Incense drifts along painted corridors, carrying whispered hymns to hidden shrines. But behind the sacred altars and the flickering oil lamps, tucked away in courtyards and quiet rooms, lies another place of equal devotion, the temple kitchen. Some trim and clean fish, caught from the temple's private pools or the slow eddies of the Nile beyond. Some must be pure and plain, a simple loaf of bread, an unseasoned cut of meat, fit for a god's table. Others are flavored with precious herbs, garlic, or coriander, to please the palates of the priests, who will share in the leftovers once the offerings have been made. Others pluck fowl, their feathers drifting to the floor in soft piles. Slabs of beef, goat, or wild game are brought in on wicker trays. The smell of raw meat mingles with the scent of baking bread and boiling lentils. At first glance, the temple kitchen may look ordinary, with its rough stone hearths, clay ovens. Before dawn's first glow slips over the temple walls, the kitchen is alive with hushed activity. The priests who work here are not grand figures in gold collars chanting before the holy statue. They are humble but vital, the hands that keep the sacred machinery turning. Each dish is made according to age-old ritual recipes. As the sun rises and the temple's main courtyards come alive with worshippers bringing petitions and prayers. Deep inside the sanctuary, the temple kitchen hums steadily. When the offerings are ready, the cooks hand them over to the officiating priests. Once the ceremony is complete, the offerings, now imbued with the god's unseen blessing, do not go to waste. A temple kitchen is never idle. After the morning rites, preparations begin for midday and evening offerings. Young novice priests learn their duties here too. Some stand at the stone counters, grinding grain by hand on flat basalt querns. Outside the kitchen walls, temple gardens flourish in neat rows, green islands in the dusty landscape. For the larger temples, food arrives daily in long caravans, fish packed in woven baskets, live geese. In the hush of midday, the kitchen quiets for a moment. When the sun dips low and the final prayers echo through the temple halls, the last offerings are prepared, small bowls of lentil stew, baskets of fresh fruit, jars of cool beer drawn from dark storage rooms. Tomorrow, as Ra rises once more over the horizon, the same cycle will begin again. Fire rekindled, bread kneaded, meat roasted, prayers whispered. Close your eyes for a moment and drift beyond the flickering oil lamps of an ancient Egyptian village. Imagine standing before a grand limestone tomb, its walls covered in painted offerings that seemed to glow softly in the torchlight. In fact, death was just the beginning of a new appetite that needed endless tending. The afterlife, that eternal field called the Field of Reeds, was imagined as a perfect version of the Nile Valley, fertile and green, forever flooded, just enough to nourish crops without washing them away. Other times, entire banquet scenes played out on the walls. Noblemen sitting cross-legged on reed mats, surrounded by musicians, dancers, and platters of roast meat and honey cakes. Hieroglyphs captured the sounds of laughter, the swirl of wine in clay cups, the promise that this was not the last meal, but one of countless to come. Spells inscribed on papyrus or spoken by priests could open the mouth of the deceased so they could eat and drink in the next world. Other incantations transformed the dead into birds or deities who never hungered again, who drank from the cool waters of the Field of Reeds and dined with the gods themselves. A son bringing bread to his father's tomb was not just feeding a spirit. He was feeding the bond between past and present. Without the bread, the beer, the painted geese and figs, he too might wander hungry in the shadows. And so entire temples bustled with priests whose sole job was to keep the royal soul well fed for eternity. Imagine that a civilization where feeding the dead was as important as feeding the living. Each meal was a conversation across time. The living asked for blessings, protection, good harvests, and the dead, well fed and satisfied, were expected to grant them. Here, the dead would plow fields that never failed, harvest grain that never spoiled, and feast at banquets that never emptied. Most common folk did not have lavish tombs painted with spells and servants. Picture the flicker of oil lamps dancing over walls, painted with endless food. Imagine the soft whisper of prayers rising like incense. And know that for the ancient Egyptians, death was never the last meal. It was the beginning of a feast that would last as long as memory, as long as stone, as long as the desert keeps its secrets. Instead, they might be buried with small clay models, tiny loaves, miniature jars of beer, little carved ducks, tokens to plead for sustenance in the hereafter. In your mind, walk through the halls of a pharaoh's burial chamber. You see the grand feast laid out, baskets of barley bread, honeycomb dripping with gold sweetness, roast quail arranged in neat rows. The smell of onions and fresh beer lingers in the stale air, the same smell that mingled with incense when priests chanted the daily offerings. Generations of priests tending invisible banquets, generations of families whispering prayers so their ancestors would never starve in the endless dark. Some families buried bread, onions, dried fish, and jugs of beer with their loved ones. Archaeologists have found these humble offerings still sealed in tombs, untouched for thousands of years, stale bread turned to dust, but the promise of an unending meal still resting quietly in the darkness. You run your fingers over the chiseled shapes of bread loaves, plump ducks, baskets of figs, and jars of honey and beer. Inside the tombs of nobles and pharaohs, priests and family members brought daily offerings, real food at first, fresh-baked bread. They believed that words and images had power. To carve a loaf of bread was to conjure it. To write the name of a food was to summon its essence for eternity. In a way, a tomb was a giant spell, a pantry of pictures to keep the soul fed forever. Roast goose, figs, dates, cucumbers, onions, fish, pulled from the river that morning, jugs of beer that still frothed with life. These offerings were laid on low stone tables before the false door, a carved doorway between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Through this door, the spirit of the deceased could slip out, inhale the aroma, taste the offering with a ghostly tongue, and slip back satisfied. This was no mere decoration. This was a promise. The promise that death was not an end, but a continuation of life's great feast. For the ancient Egyptians, the question of what to eat did not stop when breath left the body. But to reach that paradise, and to ensure the dead would not wander hungry, the living had work to do. But food rots, people forget, dynasties fall. So the ancient Egyptians painted the walls with scenes of endless feasts, visual magic to outlast the rise and fall of kingdoms. Sometimes, servants and family members were depicted bringing baskets, brimming with pomegranates or slabs of salted fish. For the poor, of course, the afterlife's pantry was more modest. There was also magic for those who couldn't afford grand paintings or baskets of real food. Imagine lying down now, drifting off while picturing those silent tombs beneath the desert sands, corridors lined with faded feasts. The feasts of the afterlife were not just for the dead. They tied the living and the departed together. Even the pharaoh, ruler of both this world and the next, depended on these offerings. So tonight, as you rest, let your mind linger in that world of eternal banquets. Sleep now and dream of endless harvests and quiet tombs where no one ever goes hungry again. You've drifted through the bustling village kitchens, the warm clay ovens, the gentle hiss of bread rising at dawn. You've seen the farmers kneeling by the floodwaters, coaxing barley and wheat from the generous Nile. But time is a river too, always flowing forward, and even the richest fields dry up when the people who tend them are gone. Tonight, lie back and imagine an abandoned kitchen in an old Egyptian house, its mud-brick walls slowly crumbling into the earth. Once, a woman stood here at dawn, kneading dough on a flat stone. The clay jars, once brimming with beer and pickled fish, lie empty. A broken reed basket spills a handful of seeds across a dirt floor that no one sweeps anymore. And here, wrapped in your blanket, you'll dream of simple bread and honey under a painted sky. The hearth is cold, the ashes long scattered by desert winds. May the stories of barley bread, river fish, and honeyed figs remind you that life's simplest moments, a meal shared, a warm hearth, a quiet night, have always been enough to fill a soul. Once, children squatted near the fire, giggling over honey cakes or licking their fingers after pinching warm bread when no one was looking. The Egyptians left us temples and pyramids, yes, but also scraps of daily life. A loaf of bread charred in a hearth, a child's painted toy, a farmer's worn sickle blade. These simple things whisper the truth that people lived here. They woke hungry. They worked, they ate, they laughed, they loved each other under the same pale stars you see tonight. Let the soft echo of ancient pots and baskets lull you. Let the forgotten meals remind you how small moments feed us long after they're gone. Once, the smell of roasting duck or fresh beer drifted through the small courtyard and mixed with the chatter of neighbors and the distant hum of the river. Now there is only silence. The pots have cracked where they sat, half buried in drifted sand. This quiet kitchen is not a ruin to mourn. It is a gentle reminder that even the most ordinary moments become precious when they re-gone. The memory of what they ate lives on in the reeds along the Nile, in the shallow graves where dried onions were tucked beside the dead, in the painted walls that tell of banquets meant to last forever. It lives in you now too, drifting through your mind as you slip deeper into sleep. So rest here, in this quiet kitchen, where the fire has gone out, but the warmth lingers. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over the Nile's old path. Somewhere, grains will sprout from ancient fields. Thank you for joining me tonight in this slow walk through the kitchens, fields, and feasts of ancient Egypt. Sleep well now. May your dreams be calm, your rest deep, and your spirit fed by memories of sunlit reeds and the gentle hush of the Nile. You are safe. You are warm. You are home. Good night, and I'll see you next time